Welcome back to Heritage Studies. Last lesson we looked at the word culture. Do you remember that definition? Well, culture is a way of life. We saw that there were cultural differences between the colonists and the Native Americans, things they disagreed on. They didn't see eye to eye on it. And what was one of those specific ways? It's the ownership of land. Do you remember how the Native Americans felt about how land should be owned? Well, land was only supposed to be used or owned for a certain amount of time. Did the colonists agree with that? No, the colonists believed that land was to be owned for life, or however long that person wanted to own it. And disagreements and fighting happened because of this. Other reasons as well, but that's the one that we looked at. Think about your culture, your way of life, how you live. What comes to mind? Well, I am from the southern part of the United States, and one thing I love about the South is sweet tea. And that is a cultural thing for the South in the United States. The northern part of the U.S. does not make sweet tea like Southerners do. They don't generally actually even have sweet tea. And I also say phrases like y'all or bless your heart all the time. That is cultural. So maybe think about some of the things that culturally are ways of life for you and where you live. Now we've looked at the Pilgrims. They came over. We looked at people that came over that did not have enough money. We called them indentured servants. And today we're going to look at a group of people called the Puritans. Get a teeny glimpse of what it was like in their colony. And as always, we have vocabulary words. Let's take a look at those. Words to be looking for today. Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's a mouthful. Massachusetts Bay Colony. Primary source. We kind of talked about that a little bit. And then a secondary source. Now go ahead, and I want you to take some time to read about the Puritans. You're going to be reading pages 15 to 17 in your student text, and I want you to be able to give an example of a primary source from your reading. So go ahead, stop and read pages 15 to 17 in your student text. Now you may be thinking what a primary source and a secondary source is. Well, that's a good question. And that is what we will be looking at for an activity in just a little bit. But we need to cover first the Puritans. So the Puritans, who were they? Well, more people kept coming to the New World. Remember, we've looked at this map several times. We have on our map Europe circled, part of Europe. That's where they were coming from. And they would come over across the Atlantic Ocean. And they would come over and settle in North America and the colonies. And the Puritans came over to the New World after the Pilgrims. And they came over for similar reasons that the Pilgrims did. They wanted religious freedoms. The Puritans sailed over, and then they settled kind of over in this area up here in Massachusetts. Obviously not that big, but in that general location, they settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the Puritans wanted a special culture. They believed in honoring God in everything. The Puritans believed that God had a covenant with them. A covenant is an agreement. And they believed that if they obeyed God, God would bless them. If they disobeyed God, God would judge or punish them. But boys and girls, God's love for us never changes based on our actions. If you have trusted Christ as your personal Savior, God's love will always be constant and consistent. It is not based on anything you do or I do, but on everything that God has done for us. Now, the Puritan colony grew quickly. They spread and formed new settlements dedicated to serving God. And altogether, how many colonies have we looked at? We've looked at 3 colonies. We've looked at Jamestown, Plymouth Colony, and now the Puritans with Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that is the main history part for today. But now I want to look at tools that historians use. And I mentioned earlier about primary sources and secondary sources. But what exactly are these? So we're going to switch gears a little bit from looking at history to tools that historians use. And you may ask, Miss Ingersoll, how do we know all of this that happened in the past? Well, historians study items that have survived the past that we can look at today. This would be a primary source. Now, a primary source is an item written or made by people who were there when the event happened. Now, can you think of something that we have learned about that would be considered a primary source? The Mayflower Compact. I hope that came to your mind. And what are some ways we would describe a primary source? Well, it's obviously very valuable to historians, written or made during the same time that the event happened, and it tells about the time period that it came from. All right, let's look at this question. What are some other examples of a primary source? Think about what we know about a primary source. Something that was there or somebody that was there when it actually happened. What examples could that be? Well, I've got some examples. Be like a diary that someone has written that was there. Primary source could be a letter telling you about the event. That would be a primary source, somebody that saw it happen and wrote it to you. Artifacts are primary sources. I brought all kinds of fun things with me today. This would be a potato masher. These are things that my grandmother played with. They're not quite artifacts, but they are pretty old because she is very, very old. These are definitely artifacts. They are arrowheads. Can you see these? These are pretty cool. These would be arrowheads, tell you about maybe the different type of Native American tribes that used them because they had different ones. Tell you which tribe it was, the style that it was made. Also an artifact would be a bullet. This is actually from the Civil War time period. And then also photos. Now, we don't have photos from way back in the 1700s because the camera was not developed yet. But this is an artifact photo. It documents the primary source. This is a picture of my family. I love acting, and this was from a play. This is a photo of all of us that were there. It is a primary source. It shows who was all there. Miss Ingersoll looks really crazy, I know. And this picture, she was playing an old lady. So those are all primary sources. That's what we consider. Oh, and maps. Cool maps, old paper, things like that. Those would be considered, have the right way, yes, primary sources. Primary sources. If I can fold it up. Primary sources. Now, I'm going to get out some fun ingredients. We're going to get out make salt clay, because you can make your own pretend artifacts. And you just need flour, you need salt, and you need some water. You need a bowl to mix it in. So I'm going to get out my ingredients. See, I have my salt, and I have my flour. You need about 1 cup of salt and 1 cup of flour. And then the water, you just kind of have to guess. So get maybe someone to help you. Pour some in, and you're just going to need to stir it. You're going to kind of want to make almost like a clay kind of texture, something that you can mush and mesh around, but you don't want it too runny because then it won't stick well together. You can see how it's already forming. Got some good, oh yeah, we got some good clay stuff going on here. Oh, I think this is just about right. See my good mushiness going on? You want to get all the flour and salt mixed in together. And this is what is making what we call salt clay. Look at that. So probably less than probably about a half a cup of water is probably what you need. But you can always make more. If you want to make more, you can make the recipe bigger so you can have lots of it. So then you have this wonderful dough. And then from this dough, you can make, let me switch out here, all kinds of interesting things to pretend they're artifacts. What I did is I kind of looked up on line on different artifacts that maybe different Native American tribes had, and I tried to replicate and make some of those different things. Or you can make up your own kinds of things. You can do all kinds of stuff. You could paint it if you wanted to. I did not. I just made it, and they get hard. You can see how the dough, you let it sit, and then it will eventually get nice and, see, it's hard, nice and hard. So those are the cool artifacts that you can make and pretend that you have made some primary sources. Right. Now, after primary sources, there is something that exists called a secondary source. Well, a secondary source is made by a person who studies primary sources. Remember, a primary source is made by people who were there when the event happened. An example of a secondary source would be me writing a book about George Washington. I was not there to observe anything that happened. I've never talked to him, but I can study things written about him from people that lived during the time he was alive, or read things that he himself wrote, visit places where he lived, go to the places he traveled to. That is all using information to write a book about him, which is a secondary source. Now, when it comes to examining sources, it is important for historians. And what questions do you think historians might use when looking at artifacts? Well, what is it? What was it used for? Like our crazy artifacts that we have going on. When and where was it written? Let's say if it was a journal. When was it used? Where was it used? How was it used? Who made it? Who used it? Oh, who was in that picture? Like the picture I showed you. Who wrote it? When was it made? Where was it made? Why was it made? They ask all of these questions. And we ask all these questions. It tells you about that person or that people group or that culture or that event that happened. And that's why people love to study history, to find out all those different things. Can you tell I like history? I love history. Now, how can we tell if it is a primary or a secondary source? Well, there's some questions that we can ask. So to determine if it's a primary or secondary source, they look at who made it. Was it made by the person actually there or someone that studied about it later on? What was it made for? Where was it made? And then, of course, when was it made would be a very important one. Was it made at the time when it happened, or was it made later on? Now, you're going to go ahead and need to pull out Activity Manual, page 8 through 9. I'm going to do the first few with you to make sure you understand your assignment because it has to do with primary and secondary sources. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first couple. These are those questions that we just asked, whether it is deciding a primary or secondary. Now, what we need to do is answer the questions to find out whether each source is primary or secondary. So what we need to do is read, first of all. So artist Gerard David lived during the same time as Queen Elizabeth of Spain. Ooh, I think that's kind of important, right? The same time. Most think that David painted this portrait of Queen Elizabeth. Listen to me, Isabella. The title of the painting is Our Lady of the Fly. So, question, who was it made by? It was made by, possibly we think, that artist, Gerard David. What was it? Well, it's the painting, right? The painting of the Queen of Spain. Let's say painting of the Queen. Where? Does it really tell us? Not really. So location is not given to us. And when was it? Let's go back and look. Well, it had to be sometime between the late 1400s, right, and the early 1500s, somewhere around there. So we would say 1400s, let's say late 1400s or early 1500s. So would this be a primary or secondary source? Basically, were both of these people there when this event happened? Yes. So it is a primary source. Do you guys see how we did that? All right, let's take a look at another one. The Mayflower that brought the Pilgrims to Plymouth in 1620 no longer exists. Some of the English donated money so a Mayflower II could be built. In 1955, skilled shipwrights started building the replica in Denton, England. There are only two differences between the original and the replica. The replica has a spiral staircase, and the original used ladders. Electric lights are installed on the replica. Oil lamps and candles were used on the original. So to me, one of the biggest words that I keep seeing is replica, right? This word replica. And the original no longer exists, the Mayflower. So kind of almost before even having to answer those questions, we kind of can know the answer whether this is primary or secondary, right? So who built this ship, this replica? Well, the skilled builders, they're called, there's a term, can you find it in the paragraph? They're called shipwrights, so skilled shipwrights. If you need to pause to keep up with my writing, that is totally fine, please do. Now, what did they build? Well, they built the Mayflower, the second, not the original. Where was it built? Let's go back and look in our paragraph. The shipwrights built the replica in. Yes, that's where they built it. When did they build it? In 1955 is when they started it. So we could say in 1955. Okay, so is this a primary or secondary source? Was this ship actually there when the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth Colony? No. So it is a secondary. Do you see the difference? Do you see how we use those questions to help us figure out whether it's primary or secondary? Did you see my thought process, how I'm asking questions and I'm looking for even keywords as I'm reading it? You'll need to complete also this page as well, doing the same exact thing, and I know you're going to do great on it. So what is our big ideas for today? Well, we looked at two groups of people have traveled to the New World, Pilgrims and Puritans. We've also looked at primary sources are made by the people who were there at the event, like the painting. He was there. He was there alive when the Queen was alive. And then secondary sources are made by people who study a primary source. Those shipwrights, they studied things that they knew about the Mayflower to make that replica of it. Now, we need to go ahead and we need to pull out our big picture handout for Chapter 1 to fill in what we've learned about today. All right, we have a few vocabulary words we need to fill in. We talked about primary source and secondary source today, and we need to give an example. So what would be a secondary source? We'll just start with that one. Well, that Mayflower 2 would definitely be a secondary source example, right? It was a replica. And what would be a primary source example? Well, the Mayflower Compact, right? That's a primary source. So we have a primary source and a secondary source. If you have a different one that you would like to put down, that is fine. Just make sure it actually is a primary source example and then a secondary source example. Besides needing to do the primary and secondary source, you have a review sheet, activity manual page 10. Let's go over the instructions for it so you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You need to fill in the blanks, looking at the terms over here. This should be easy for you. You should know all these. We've talked about these. And then at the bottom, again, you have mark all the correct answers. Each item may have more than one correct answer. So go ahead and read through the questions. What statements are true about the Puritans? And then read about it and mark the ones that are accurate. Remember, is your book supposed to be helpful for this? Yes, your book is supposed to be helpful. Use your book. Go back and read through if you're not exactly sure what an answer is. The more time that you spend on this and the better work that you do, the better you're going to do on your test later on. The information is going to stay. Make sure to complete your assignment at Activity Manual on page 10. It is a review study guide over everything we've covered up until now. So make sure you do your best on it. Take your time. I'm really enjoying our journey through early American history, and I can't wait till next time to continue on our journey. So do your assignment, and I will see you next time.